Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. My name is Eliane Schmid, and I will be hosting today's podcast introducing Confucius. Joining me is Kai Marchal, professor for philosophy at Tsinghua University. Good morning.
Good morning. Hello, Eliane.
Mr. Marchal has already contributed to several wisdom talks about Taoism and will now help us contextualize and refine our knowledge on, arguably, China's most famous teacher, philosopher, and political theorist. Confucius' ideas have had a deep impact on people, not only from his homeland, but also East Asian and, nowadays, Western countries. Yet similar to Socrates, a figure we have also encountered in previous wisdom talks, we do not have any original texts composed by Confucius, or Master Kong, as he is also called sometimes. Nonetheless, we refer to Confucius' sayings when we refer to his words of wisdom, namely the so-called Analects. Who was Confucius?
Yeah, that's a great question. So he is a famous teacher, as you just said. So people tend to have a lot of respect for Confucius. So he is somehow a serious person, an old wise man, as many imagine him to be. And if you have a closer look at his personality, you see that he was not just this boring schoolman or school teacher he is often portrayed as, but he was actually quite a funny person, a lot of irony. And you also often get this sense that he was kind of hiding away from his students, his disciples. So he had so many disciples and he was constantly talking. That's the sense you get when you read his most famous book, the Analects. But then he was also hiding, so there are a lot of cryptic statements in this book. That's kind of the interesting side, the interesting aspect about Confucius. He was a very moralistic person. He was trying to transmit his moral teachings, but then he was also constantly trying to, maybe to confuse his audience, to puzzle his audience.
So does that mean that although he was a teacher and he passed on his wisdom, he actually was also a bit of a private person when you say that he sometimes hid away?
Yes, exactly. So there are some of we will talk about this most famous book, the Analects, later in more detail, but just to give you one example, there often he comes away as a very pessimistic person. So he is, on the one hand, he is very optimistic, constantly talking about the need to cultivate and to become wise. But then he sometimes has these more resignative moments when he just says, I should just give up and what the fuck, so in a way, or what I just don't want to talk any longer to you, the students. So 527 in the 5th chapter, 27th section, there is this strange statement, I should just give up. Or then in chapter 14, the section 25, there is this strange dialogue, and I just quote here from the text. So a minister sent a messenger to Confucius, and Confucius sat down beside the messenger and asks him, how is your master? And the messenger replied, my master wishes to reduce his thoughts, but he has not yet been able to do so. After the messenger left, Confucius said, now that is a messenger, that is a messenger. So this is the kind of dialogue we often find in the Analects. You don't really know what's he doing there or to whom he is talking and what kind of message he wants to transmit. So is this a compliment for the messenger or is this rather a compliment for the master? Who did what and who is good, who is bad? This is sometimes really difficult to decide.
And before we go in deeper in these passages and what exactly Confucius taught or didn't teach, could you give us some historical background? So when were these Analects recorded? And so what was the general setting?
Yeah, so Confucius was born in the year 551 before Christ, and he died in 479, so like late 6th century before Christ. He was a native of the small state Lu, in the modern province Shandong. So in China was not one empire yet, but there were many states. And Lu was one of the smaller states, rather minor state, a vassal state. But it was considered to be very important, culturally important, because the ruling house of Lu was related to the royal family of the Zhou. So our listeners might have heard of the Zhou dynasty. It was a very important, legendary dynasty, which ruled China about 1,000 years before Christ. And in the state of Lu, it was said Zhou culture was preserved particularly well. So Confucius, from this state of Lu, where he was born, was thought to be he wanted to transmit Zhou culture. So to say a few more words about his biography, his father died when he was very young, and he was not entirely a legitimate son. So his father was very old and he married Confucius' mother, and his mother apparently was from a minor tribe. So his whole family background was rather humble. So a poor family. His father, as I just said, died when Confucius was very young. So Confucius also was a member of the scholar official class, a rather quite important class there, but he was at the lowest grade. He was the lowest office holder. So in the state of Lu, he became an official later in his life, but his early years were quite difficult since his family was rather humble. That's kind of the sense you get of him. He was really a hardworking man. He had very strong aspirations, wanted to make something out of his life. And what he thought was important, the most important means to achieve this goal was to learn. So there is this emphasis on learning and becoming a better person in his thought, and in his biography also confined this. So in later life, he became the Minister of Justice in the state of Lu. But then there was this famous episode when he decided to leave the state of Lu. So he was not satisfied any longer with the political circumstances in the state of Lu, and he left. And then what is very famous, he started to travel around in the whole of China, and he was constantly trying to meet important people and meet the rulers of these various states and convince them to start political reforms and to restore the former order of the Zhou dynasty, the order, the values and the rituals. So this is more or less his biography. And you get this the feeling that he really had a very strong sense of a mission. So restore the former glory of the Zhou dynasty and to convince people to improve themselves and to engage in self-cultivation and become a good person.
Now, on these travels, he had many devout scholars or students, rather, following him. Could you explain more about how they came to suddenly follow him? And in that sense, also, when was Confucius suddenly regarded as a wise man?
So traditionally, it is said that Confucius had about 3,000 disciples. So the number of 3,000 is important. And in fact, this might be more or less true, the true number. So he had a huge number of students. And if you open the Analects, so the book I already mentioned, which was not written by Confucius, but which was most probably compiled by his disciples, probably already the first generation of disciples started compiling this book, and then many other students and disciples, probably also second and third generation, participated in this compilation project. So when you open this book, the Analects, then you meet so many different students. They're really like almost 100. You can very many students, and these students often also, like Confucius, came from humble backgrounds, but they were very devoted to him, and some were good at ritual tasks. So as I already said, Confucius really emphasized the need for rituals, and especially the rituals of these former dynasties, the Zhou dynasty and other former dynasties. So you had to be good in this. So some of his students were good at ritual tasks. Some were good in the arts, so something similar like martial arts. And then some were skilled in administration, and some even had political experiences as local officials in the city of Lu. And for Confucius, the goal was always really to go to the court and to have a political career. So he was, his students, he had all these followers. They were going with him on his travels. And they were always seeking to achieve something on a great scale in politics. Just to give you one example, the Master Zeng, one of his most famous disciples, and he's particularly important in the history of Confucianism, since the authorship of two other extremely important texts was attributed to him, the Great Learning and the Classic of Filial Piety. So this Master Zeng became a teacher himself. So he was first a student, a disciple of Confucius, but because he was so outstanding, he was really good in learning and in transmitting the Confucian way. He also became a teacher in his own right. And he was particularly important because one of his grandsons supposedly was a teacher of Mencius. And Mencius is the second most important Confucian after Confucius.
So now you said that some of these students then wrote down what Confucius actually said. Could you describe a bit more how the texts came into being, how what Confucius said was put to text and passed on until today?
There are many Confucian texts, and many of these Confucian texts also record sayings by Confucius. So by sayings, I mean short statements. These statements are quite cryptical because we don't really know the context in which they were said. So you have many, many different texts containing Confucian sayings, but the most important text is indeed the Analects. So the Analects has 20 chapters, and even today we are not sure who were the compilers. So Confucius himself did not compile this text, but his disciples did. And if you read these 20 chapters closely, then you will realize that there were different strata, different layers. The text has different layers. So the earlier chapters, first 15 chapters, were kind of really written shortly after compiled after Confucius' death. So these sayings are often thought to be more authentic. And then the later chapters, last 4 or 5 chapters, are kind of only loosely connected to Confucius thought, and there are even some Taoist elements in them, or even some things in these chapters which Confucius could not have known. So that is more or less the structure of the Analects. And traditional readers have always wondered whether under this chaotic surface you could not find some sense of an order. So there are all these statements. Let me give a few more examples. What you often get there is Confucius talking to his disciples in a very serious tone. And so there are a lot of descriptions in the Analects of Confucius' behavior. So in particular in chapter 10, the way how he sleeps, the way how he eats, the way how he talks to students, to disciples, but also to the ruler. This is all described in very vivid details. Elias Canetti once said that the chapter 10 of the Analects is probably the first biography of a real individual. So because you get this very vivid sense of Confucius as an individual. And then there are these short sayings, for example, in chapter 4, where he makes really quite commonsensical remarks. So, for example, he says, when occupying your pace, remain reverent. When performing public duties, be respectful. And when dealing with others, be dutiful. In chapter 13, section 19. So that is when he was asked about goodness, Ren, and we will talk about Ren later, he gives this sort of answer. So he directly tells his students what to do, how to be a good person. And then there are all these different definitions, almost definitions like statements about the different virtues you need to emulate. So Ren is goodness, which I already mentioned, and there is the sense of justice, appropriateness, Yi. And then there's Li, propriety, or the sense for the rituals, as you can say, but also more common, down-to-earth virtues like courage. So you need to be courage, and you need to be reverent to show respect towards the elders. So this is another important dimension of the Analects. And then there are these often quite puzzling dialogues, and I already mentioned one of them. And maybe let me give you another example of this sort of dialogue. So there is this one saying where he says, "It is heaven itself that has endowed me with virtue. What have I to fear from the likes of Huan Tui?" So first, there's this sense of mission you find here. So heaven itself has endowed Confucius with virtue. He quite often refers to heaven. And then the second part is, what have I to fear from the likes of Huan Tui? So of course, most of our listeners won't know who is Huan Tui. There is this kind of a cryptic Chinese name. And this is often the case in the Analects, that you really have to look up all these names and all these details, and which makes it quite difficult to read the Analects. But it's also, in a way, the fun of reading the Analects. There are so many details. And if you spend some time with Confucius reading the Analects, then you will realize there's this kind of a network of hidden connections under the surface. So Huan Tui actually was a really bad person, a powerful minister of another state, the state of Song, who tried to kill Confucius by cutting the tree down under which Confucius and his disciples were practicing the rituals. So you see, Confucius, he had this political career, but he was constantly trying to improve the rituals and to teach the rituals. So he, under this particular tree there, he was probably with a huge group of disciples, 20, 30 disciples. And this minister, Huan Tui, sent some people out to cut the tree down and to kill Confucius. So that's actually one of these speaking details there, an assassination attempt against Confucius. But Confucius doesn't care, and he thinks we should not fear bad people. We should just persevere, and we should just be free of anxiety and fear, as he says in chapter 12, section 4.
Now, would contemporary readers have known who this minister was? Would they have read later on these texts or the Analects and have known who this person was? And you said that it was also sometimes almost spiritual. Was Confucius also religious in a way, or did he follow his own religion in a way?
Yeah, these are two very, very good questions. So did the readers of his time know all these people? Yeah, probably. At least in the 5th century and the 4th century, most readers were familiar with these people. So because the text of the Analects, like many other texts, was learned by heart, so it was internalized. People knew these texts by heart, and it was part of language education. So that from very early on, children, and the Han Dynasty later on, children often were just learning the Analects. And of course, the teacher were explaining then who were these people and what were they doing. So somebody like Huan Tui was a very famous person, and everybody knew of this. Of course, in later centuries, if you think of like Confucius died in the 5th century and in the medieval age, at around 1200. So China was a big country, a big empire. Then, of course, there was a long historical distance there separating people from Confucius, and people were not so much aware of all this, and there were a lot of controversies about details, how to read the Analects, and people wrote long commentaries to explain the Analects. So this is my answer to your first question. And then the second question, so was Confucius a religion person? Another question which has been debated for centuries, or decades at least. So the term religion is, of course, of Western origin. So you don't find this term in classical Chinese. But there is certainly a certain religious dimension to Confucius. So his sense of a mission is connected to this idea of the heaven protecting him, and heaven even sending messages. So he's speaking through nature, the 4 seasons. If you pay attention to heaven, you will understand what heaven's intentions are. Heaven is not a god, it's not a personal god, but heaven is like the Tao, it's there, and we can have trust in heaven and we can follow his mission. And then there is, of course, also another important dimension, ghosts. So Confucius and ghosts, he often speaks about ghosts, but it's not so clear, does he really believe in ghosts? Ghosts of the ancestors. Now, that's, of course, very important in Confucianism. We have all these family rituals for the ancestors, and somehow the ancestors were thought to be still present today. So maybe in form of ghosts, and then there were evil spirits and all kinds of spiritual beings. And Confucius wanted us to show respect to these ghosts. He was not entirely convinced that they existed, or he didn't want to commit himself to say that they are ghosts, but he never denied their existence either. That's another important dimension of his spiritual life.
Now, before we go into more detail about these teachings of Confucius, did he actually intend for these teachings to be passed on? And how did the disciples that grew in number find him? So I would still like to know more about how this all came into being, how he became acknowledged as a wise man.
So yes, of course, he intended his teachings to be passed on. That's the reason why he was talking constantly to people. He was gathering around himself so many people. But then, he also had a certain sense of the limitations of language. So often you get the sense that he believed that through behavior is a better means to transmit his teaching than words. Rituals are very important. So he spent time on organizing these rituals, and then he certainly wanted his disciples to emulate his behavior. So that's one way of passing on his teaching. And then there's this very intriguing fact about the Analects that he uses different ways to talk to different people. So we will speak about Socrates later. There's one important difference between Confucius and Socrates, which I could already mention here. So Confucius was aware that some of his disciples were more gifted and others were less gifted. So in particular, there was one very gifted student, Yan Hui, almost like a genius, and later readers really enjoyed Yan Hui. But unfortunately, Yan Hui died very young. He's a very young man. But Confucius almost considered him to be his son. Confucius had a son, but he did not transmit his teachings to his son, not in a particular way, but to Yan Hui. But then Yan Hui died very early. So you can imagine that the other disciples were kind of envious of Yan Hui. So there was a certain competition between his disciples. who would get the transmission, the real teaching. And Confucius, in a way, was aware of this, the fact that you need to talk to different people in different ways. So this certainly shaped the transmission of his teachings. And as I already said, for example, the master Zheng, he became a teacher in his own right, and there were different lines of traditions and of transmission. And among later day Confucians, you always have the problem that you first need to establish yourself as an orthodox follower, so that you really got the orthodox, the right teaching of Confucius. And that is not so easy because there are so many different lines of transmission and so many different texts.
So now let us do our own readings in that case of these texts. And I would like to ask about the two terms that you also already mentioned, and I apologize for butchering these words, Junse and Ren. So could you tell us what is unique about Confucius' use of them and how he implemented them in his teachings?
Yeah, so Ren is a very important word in Chinese. It has often been translated as humanity. In older translations, benevolence. But I think the most appropriate translation term in English is goodness. So goodness as a virtue. It's an overarching virtue, and it includes many other virtues. For example, empathy, courage, and respect. So goodness is the term Confucius is talking about in almost all passages. Constantly there are people coming to him and asking, what is goodness? And then he gives these kind of short answers and these definition-like answers. They are not really definitions, but somehow he tries to define them contextually in certain contexts. So Ren, what is Ren? Yeah, what is goodness? For example, I think I already mentioned this. He once said, when occupying your place, remain reverent. When performing public duties, be respectful. And when dealing with others, be dutiful. That's one of his definitions of Ren. And this is already a quite complex definition. And if you think of this, could we easily do this? Could we be reverent? Could we be respectful? And could we be dutiful all in the same time? It's probably quite a challenging task. And then he also connects goodness to the capacity of enjoying happiness, but also enduring hardness and remain constant in adversity in chapter 4, section 2. So there are many different conditions and ways of defining goodness, but you see that it's really the most important virtue for Confucius. It makes you a human person to be good. So, and then Junzi, the gentleman, is what you could just call the ideal ethical agent. So as a good person, a moral person, you are a gentleman. And this is not related to a class. This is not related to your appearance or to your family background. This is just about your behavior.
And did Confucius' sayings, were they meant as precise rules to become such a good person, a kind person, a virtuous person? Or were these more guidelines? And were they meant, you said they were meant for all kinds of classes. Were they also meant for, as you said, children to adults and elderly? And were they also meant for both genders?
So you get the sense that he's a very demanding teacher, and that he's quite conservative with regards to rituals. So there are some passages where he admits that rituals, you remember these rituals often come from old times, they often reflect very old values. Sometimes he admits that we can adjust rituals, we have to adjust rituals to the present. But this is rather an exception. Normally we just need to follow the rituals. So here he sounds quite conservative and quite rigid. But then, of course, there's a more skeptical or more flexible Confucius. So he thinks that ultimately, finally, after you have internalized all these rituals, you will become a gentleman, and you will act in a very natural way. You will act in accordance with the rituals, but naturally. So, for example, in the final section of book 15, there is this very beautiful story about the music master. No? So a music master who was blind came to see Confucius, and Confucius then leads the music master into the hall where all the other guests are seated. And he just says in a very simple manner, he tells the music master who's blind, here are the steps, here is your seat. So in this particular context, Confucius just gets rid of all the ritual requirements, and he speaks in a quite casual manner. Sometimes you can do this, but normally you have to be really cautious in what you say and in the way how you act. So Sometimes he also makes these very intriguing decisions where he really contradicts social prejudice, social conventions. So rituals are not the same as social conventions. Let me give an example. So, for example, in chapter 5, in the first section, he decided to give his daughter to Gong Yechang, who was once imprisoned as a criminal. You have to know that in classical China, to be a criminal was really a social stigma. So the social stigma was enormous, but Confucius simply did not care. He just gave his daughter to this Gong Yechang. So there is a certain openness there. He is rigid on the one hand, but then he also thinks that we have to be spontaneous and natural in other contexts. Yeah.
So Confucius was not a stickler for rules in that case. Can you also see this in his conversations? Did the conversations change depending on, you said that language is important for him. Did they change depending on the group of people he was talking to? And are they comparable to the dialogues of Plato?
So yeah, this is another very important question. I think I already mentioned that he adjusted his way of speaking to the audience. So he was quite flexible there. He was trying to speak to people in their particular individual circumstances. So sometimes when a student was just too relaxed, he reminded him, and of course these were mostly men, there's only one woman in the Analects. So to answer the other question, he's not really interested in gender equality, or he's not a modern man, a modern person, but yeah, you could worry here that he is too focused on man and doesn't really care too much about women and children. Of course, he was thinking about children, so children should be educated. That was important. In these dialogues, he speaks in a way, like Socrates. Like Socrates, he's concerned with goodness and with the ethical life. But if you have a closer look, there are, of course, differences. So, for example, one important difference is that the Confucius disciples never directly challenged Confucius' authority. So this is important to remember. And second, the goal of these discourses or these dialogues was not primarily to find knowledge, to achieve knowledge, but rather to convince the ruler to reform the empire. So that was a political goal. And Confucius wanted his disciples to become officials. So there's a certain context here, and this is how I would answer to your question there. Yeah.
What about these teachings and the concepts that Confucius set up today? Can they still be, or are they still regarded as guidelines for social order in China? Or how would you contextualize the Confucius sayings today?
That is a wonderful question. Yeah. So there are some people who are really optimistic in believing that China can become Confucian again, or other Asian societies can become Confucian again. Over the course of the 20th century, you had many attempts in Japan, in Korea, in Vietnam, in China, and Taiwan to actually restore Confucian teachings, often by quite conservative political movements or even fascist political movements. In China, you had the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek in the 30s, who tried to restore Confucian values in a campaign, and this campaign looked quite fascist, and they actually directly learned from German National Socialism. So it's a conservative discourse under the conditions of modern societies that needs to be emphasized. Of course, there are also people in the civil society, intellectuals, teachers, or other elites who were interested in Confucius and who promoted Confucian ideas, and even under quite liberal conditions or democratic conditions. So it is not necessarily conservative, it's not necessarily reactionary, but it often becomes a means of restoring order, Confucianism, under modern conditions. So there are two more passages which are quite puzzling. First, there is in chapter 1, section 8, there is this idea mentioned by Confucius. Friendship means to not accept as a friend one who is not your equal. So this sounds quite condescending, and even offensive to us. Do not accept as a friend one who is not your equal. So, and there certainly is a sense in Confucius that he sometimes can be quite condescending. So that's one of the reasons why I'm quite skeptical. Of course, you can promote certain ideas from Confucian texts, but there is a certain tension there. Another important section is 17.25. about women. I already mentioned gender equality. So Confucius was not really interested in gender equality, and he rarely ever talked about women. They were simply not the object of his interest. So, but there in 1725, he says, women and servants are particularly hard to manage. If you are too familiar with them, they grow insolent. But if you are too distant, they grow resentful. So, and this has, of course, made many people in East Asia hate Confucius and strongly dislike Confucius. And not only feminists, but liberals and reformers. And many people really thought this, really offensive. And so we should not forget this tension. Now, of course, the Chinese government today promotes Confucian values. And in Singapore and in other Asian societies, you have similar attempts. But it's not easy, I think. It's not easy there will certainly be tensions, and many people will revolt if you try to convince them of Confucius' wisdom.
So I would say that these two passages that you quoted are not particularly wisdomous, if I can say this. But I am sure that there are some aspects of wisdom that we can find in Confucius. He was, after all, regarded as a wise man. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on how we can become wiser by reading the Analects? Of course, staying on our toes and not believing everything.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's, I think, the right attitude. So he often speaks about these virtues in a very moving way. And virtues, of course, are important. And even today, I would argue, we need to be more virtuous. So, for example, modesty, if you think of a virtue like modesty or civility, to be politeness, this is lacking in modern societies. And Confucius was really good in describing these virtues and to making a case for them. So in chapter 11, section 19, again, he speaks about Yanhui, and he describes him in a very moving way as somebody who was perpetually empty or modest. Yeah. So people can know a lot, but they should be aware of the limits of their knowledge. This is one basic Confucian idea. And there's much to agree here. Modesty is often also directly connected to this politeness. This is still, I think, shaping people's behavior in a good way. So this is certainly not identical with wisdom. But you could argue that if a person wants to be wiser, he or she should try to be more modest and be less self-centered. And then there are, there are many more interesting passages. So in the later reception process, Confucius sometimes was described almost like a koan master, like a Japanese chan master. So, for example, in 9.17, there is this famous description of Confucius standing next to a river, just sighing and saying something along the line, the water is there flowing and it never stops. So again, a very simple statement, but East Asian readers have often read it in a more complex way. So again, there's this idea that under the surface, a lot is hidden there. So especially in the 12th and 13th century, when people were very fond of Buddhism, they thought that Confucius here actually is also like a Buddhist Chan master. He's describing the impermanence of things. That everything changes, nothing is permanent. So like, for example, in the Surangama Sutra, there is a similar description of a river and of the need to contemplate the river. So this need to contemplative attitude is very important actually in the Analects. And you could say that this is part of being wise, of wisdom, that we need to adopt a contemplative attitude towards life and to be open to change.
Being open to change, that sounds like a good thing to keep in mind always. Now we're rapidly moving towards the end of this wisdom talk. As a last question, I wanted to ask you to embed this all. I know this is going to be a big question, but in the previous talks that we had with you, and you just now touched on Buddhism as well, and Taoism was also touched on in this wisdom talk. But just to bring this all together a bit for our listeners, how would you connect the teachings of Confucius and the other big wisdom topics that we looked at? So again, Taoism and Buddhism. How do people also use that today? Because I know, for example, in Japan, people like to pick out things from different wisdom let's call them wisdom blocks, or I don't know how, but how would you describe this?
Yeah, that's a big question indeed. I'm not sure how to answer there. So I think, practice, the notion of practice, I mentioned it briefly, but actually we could say more there. So Confucius was constantly talking, but you also get the sense that ultimately for him, words are less important than practice, behavior. So in 19.12, there is this emphasis on what he calls mopping and sweeping, answering summons and entering and retiring from a formal company. So this kind of basic behavior, which we often in modernity neglect. So we are very much focused on the things we want to achieve, and we believe that we can shape the world according to our desires. But in Confucius, you get the sense that actually we should do less of this, and we should be more concerned with our spiritual life. Maybe let's put it this way. So, and this is somehow very similar to what Taoists and Buddhists want to achieve. So that in order to change the world, it is more important first to change yourself and your own behavior. So I think people in even today in contemporary societies in East Asia, some people are still under the spell of Confucius and other wise teachers. So in the sense that the mission or their teaching is secular, they don't speak about God or a transcendent entity, but they make a case against consumerist societies and against this drive for self-perfection or for self-fulfillment, which is typical for our modern existence.
So being open to change, trying to be your best self, to say that rather bluntly, these are the things that I think we can take from today's talk, amongst others, but in a nutshell. And so what is left to say, thank you very much for explaining all these things to us, Kai.
Thank you, Elian. Yeah, that was wonderful.
At this point, I would also like to invite our listeners to follow further wisdom talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. Please also consider sharing your own wisdom thoughts on the Metis portal. We have an open call for contributions about any topic connected to wisdom that you would like to share with the Metis community. There are also more information to be found in the show notes below, for example, where we have these citations from. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.